The results of the 2021 census of England and Wales are slowly being published, and two results are causing a right-wing freakout. Here's the first one. It turns out that less than half of people in England and Wales are now Christian. This graph from the BBC shows that the number of Christians has been steadily dropping over the last 20 years. In 2001, over 70% of the two nations were Christian. Now it's only 47%. There's been a slight increase in the number of Muslims and those of other religions over that period, but the really noticeable increase is in those who don't identify with any religion at all. They've gone from around 15% of the population in 2001 to nearly 40% now. So people have been generally drifting away from religion, a fact that can hardly come as a surprise to most people. But that didn't stop great replacement theory advocate Douglas Murray from tweeting this killer take. So he's tweeting a Guardian article with the headline, "England and Wales now minority Christian countries, census reveals." And he tweets, "As predicted 5 years ago in The Strange Death of Europe, which the Guardian denounced at the time as xenophobic, I suppose facts eventually catch up with everyone, even the Guardian." So the idea that that headline would mean that they suddenly agree with his book, slightly bizarre. Let's look at what Murray's prediction was. In his 2017 book, The Strange Death of Europe, Murray discusses the drop in the number of Christians and rise in the number of Muslims recorded by the 2011 census. But he draws this odd conclusion. To study the results of that sentence was to stare at one particularly unalterable conclusion, which was that mass immigration was in the process of altering, indeed had already altered, the country completely. By 2011, Britain had already become a radically different place from the place it had been for centuries. I mean, obviously, it was a different place than it's been for centuries. We didn't used to have motorways and tube stations and pret-a-manger. You don't need this sort of pseudo-intellectual crap to tell you that things have changed over the past few centuries. In the 10 years since the 2011 census, the number of people identifying as Muslim has increased from 2.7 million to 3.9 million. That's still just 6.5% of the population. We are a long way from being replaced, fellow whites watching. Sorry, it's slightly weird for you to say. Hardly evidence of a complete alteration of the country by mass immigration. Now, joining Murray's xenophobic wobbly, Nigel Farage posted this video on social media.
The Office of National Statistics figures are out today showing that London, Birmingham and Manchester are all now minority white cities. Massive demographic changes taking place in our country. More significantly for the country as a whole, it shows that only 46% now identify as Christian. So there is a massive change in the identity of this country that is taking place through immigration. You may think it's a good thing, you may think it's a bad thing.
Again, Farage, they're trying to link the drop in Christians to an exponential rise in other religions through immigration. Complete nonsense, as we've just talked about. And the other claim there was also nonsense. He said that London, Manchester and Birmingham are now majority non-white cities. Of course, this doesn't matter. It wouldn't matter if they were. But Farage hasn't even got his facts right. So this graph from the BBC shows the data for the percentage of people who identify as white in these three cities. In Manchester, it's 57%. In London, it's 54%. And in Birmingham, it's 49%. Nigel Farage was, of course, confusing white people with white British people. Details clearly aren't his strong point. In any case, that's not the real problem with Farage's video, a fact pithily summed up by none other than Sajid Javid. So he tweeted this, so he's tweeting that video we just showed you, and he says, "So what?" Back now to Douglas Murray, who thinks he does have an answer to that question, to the question, so what? I see many commentators on the census results saying, so what if people who identify as white British are a minority in London, Birmingham, Leicester, Manchester, etc.? Just one answer to this, which is because we never voted for this. Quite the opposite, in fact. Now, of course, there are many things we don't vote for. To go back to my previous example, we didn't vote for metro stations or pret-a-manger. They still appear. And we clearly haven't voted for the opposite either. So if you're talking about the cities he's talking about, let's go for London, for example. We very recently elected twice a mayor of the city who is non-white. So it doesn't seem like London is full of all of these people who are incredibly stressed that not everyone's white anymore. You know, this idea that Douglas Murray speaks for the people of Britain's metropoles is completely bizarre.
This is just like good old-fashioned traditional race science. Like we've ditched all the proxies, we've ditched all the kind of smokescreen, and we're just going back to the old school eugenics paranoia about preserving racial purity, about believing that racial categories have some kind of connection to moral content and character, and fearing that if you dilute the racial superiority or the racial concentration of a particular group in a particular area, there's going to be some kind of hideous moral or political decline. When Douglas Murray uses this as like some kind of self-congratulatory moment to be like, see, I was right all along, as if it somehow vindicates his style of politics. I mean, obviously, it goes without saying. Firstly, he's saying, oh, the Guardian accused me of being xenophobic. And it's like, the Guardian is very much vindicated in that. The argument was never that there will never be a point at which, major cities in the UK might not be one day, in his book, majority white. The argument was always that it doesn't matter because racial categories are not connected to moral character. That's kind of the basic idea there. And, I'm glad that Javid came out and said it. Who cares? I mean, it would be nice if he wasn't also part of a government that was implicitly using great replacement fears and, fears about there being too many immigrants and that being an invasion. It'd be nice if he wasn't part of a government that was using that in order to drown refugees in the Mediterranean. Because that is ultimately the end point of this kind of politics. What really annoys me as well is like when he talks about how, the problem here is that we didn't vote for it. So he's trying to kind of cloud this in some kind of democratic issue or some kind of almost technocratic issue. And part of me is just like, well, Douglas, one fifth of the world's population also didn't vote for the British to colonize them. And yet there you were. They also don't continue to vote for the ongoing forms of neo-colonialism. The Iraqis, for example, didn't vote to be invaded by Britain and America, even though it was apparently on their behalf. So I don't really see his same vim for those kind of instances of, unwarranted invasions that are actually invasions rather than imagined ones. But of course, it's not about that. It's not about some kind of technocratic commitment to democracy. It's, the people that Murray is speaking to when he says these things, the people he's trying to mobilize, the people he's trying to aggravate. And let's not forget that there's been a lot of work, the people who are the most pressed about what's happening in London and Manchester and Leicester are people who don't live there, people who are being fed fear-mongering content about what's going on in these major cities as a result of, increased diversity. So when he says these things, he never actually needs to explain what he means when he says the misreported fact that London or that Birmingham or whatever is no longer a majority white city. He doesn't need to elaborate on what to fear there because the people he's communicating to know exactly what he means. And what he means is the same thing that Enoch Powell articulated in 1968, which continues to be an incredibly mainstream narrative and rhetoric in this country and in the British political sphere. And it's a fear that the power of white supremacy will be compromised or affected by racial mixing and by diversity. That's it. That's what the fear is here. And the people that he's speaking to have an inherent fear of that. And that's what he's playing up. And so I think we need to call it like we see it, which Sajid Javid did to an extent, but also, he could stand to put his money where his mouth is.